The coffee was still warm when I heard the crunch of gravel in my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched my son David step out of his silver Audi, adjusting his tie like a man preparing for a business meeting. It was 8:30 on a Saturday morning. David never visited on Saturday mornings anymore. I set my mug down on the counter, the same blue ceramic one Margaret had bought at that little pottery shop in Asheville, the one with the tiny chip on the handle she'd refused to let me throw away. Character, she'd called it. Everything in this house had character now, which was another way of saying everything here belonged to someone who wasn't coming back. David knocked twice, sharp and efficient. I opened the door to find him scanning the porch with the calculating gaze of a man appraising real estate. His hair had gone silver at the temples since Margaret's funeral, and the expensive suit made him look like a stranger wearing my son's face. "Morning, Dad." His smile was practiced, the kind salesmen use when they're working up to something big. "David," I stepped back to let him in. "You're up early for a weekend." He moved through the hallway with purposeful steps, his eyes catching on details I'd stopped noticing years ago. The family photos lining the walls, the antique side table Margaret had refinished herself, the worn spot in the hardwood where she used to set down her gardening basket. Everything here still bore her fingerprints, her choices, her voice telling me to put the coffee maker there, hang that picture here, keep the good china in the cabinet she could reach without a stepladder. "Coffee?" I offered, though something in his posture suggested this wasn't a social call. "Sure." David followed me into the kitchen, but instead of sitting at the table where we used to share Sunday breakfast, he remained standing, hands clasped behind his back like a lawyer addressing a jury. "Actually, Dad, I wanted to talk to you about something important." I poured him a cup, watching his reflection in the window above the sink. The morning light caught the sharp angles of his face, so much like Margaret's when she was thinking through a problem. But where her expressions had been warm, analytical, in service of understanding, David's carried something colder, something that made my chest tighten. "What's on your mind?" He took the cup, but didn't drink. Instead, he walked to the breakfast nook where Margaret and I had eaten thousands of meals together, where she'd sat with her reading glasses perched on her nose, working through crossword puzzles, while I read the sports section aloud. David set the cup down, without tasting it. "This house," he said, gesturing vaguely at the walls around us, "it's too much for you to manage alone. All this space, all this upkeep. Don't you think it's time to consider alternatives?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Alternatives. As if 43 years of marriage, of building something together from nothing, could be reduced to a real estate transaction. "I manage fine," I said evenly. "Do you?" David pulled out his phone, swiping to what looked like a notes app. "When's the last time you had the gutters cleaned? The furnace serviced? That loose board on the front steps could be a liability issue." I'd noticed the board myself just last week. Had planned to fix it this weekend, actually, but hearing David catalog my shortcomings like items on a punch list made something in my stomach turn over. "Since when do you worry about my gutters?" "Since Mom died." The words came out sharper than he'd intended. I could see him recalibrate, soften his expression. "Look, Dad, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to be practical. You're 72 years old, living alone in a 4-bedroom house with a 2-car garage and half an acre of yard. It doesn't make sense." I moved to the window, looking out at the garden Margaret had spent 15 years perfecting. The roses she'd babied through droughts and harsh winters were blooming now, pink and white blossoms that seemed to glow in the morning light. Beyond them, the oak tree we'd planted the year David was born cast long shadows across the lawn. "Your mother loved this place," I said quietly. "Mom's gone, Dad." The words hit like a physical blow, not because they weren't true, but because of how easily he said them, as if her absence were simply a fact to be acknowledged and moved past, rather than a daily weight I carried in my chest. "I know she's gone," I said, my voice steady despite the heat building behind my ribs. "But this house isn't just a house. It's where we built our life together, where we raised you, where she died." David's tone had gone clinical, professional. "In that bedroom upstairs, after 6 months of hospice care that nearly broke you both. Tell me that's not part of why you want to stay." I turned to face him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "That maybe you're holding on to this place for the wrong reasons. That maybe it's time to let go and find somewhere more suitable, smaller, easier to maintain. closer to medical facilities. Medical facilities. I repeated the words like I was testing their weight. You think I'm dying? I think you're getting older. I think living alone in isolation isn't healthy for anyone, especially someone your age with your history. My history. Another careful phrase that could mean anything or nothing. I walked to the refrigerator, ostensibly to refill my coffee, but really to buy time. The kitchen felt smaller with David in it, as if his presence were drawing the walls closer together. When I turned back, he was studying me with the same expression Margaret used to wear when she was trying to solve a particularly difficult crossword clue. What exactly are you worried about, son? I'm worried about you making good decisions, about your judgment, about... He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. About things I've been hearing. The phrase landed with uncomfortable precision. What things? Neighbors mentioning that you've been forgetful, leaving lights on all night. Mrs. Peterson said she saw you mowing the lawn at 6 in the morning last Tuesday. I had mowed the lawn early, couldn't sleep, figured I might as well do something useful while the world was quiet. But hearing it filtered through David's concern made it sound like the behavior of a man losing his grip. Since when do you talk to Mrs. Peterson? Since I started worrying about you. David's voice softened, taking on the tone he'd used as a child when he wanted something he wasn't sure he'd get. Dad, I love you. We all do. That's why Lisa and I think it might be time to consider some changes. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, who smiled at family gatherings but had never quite looked comfortable in this house, who'd suggested more than once that the family photos on the mantel were overwhelming and that Margaret's china cabinet made the dining room feel cluttered. Who'd grown up in a family that moved every few years for job opportunities and couldn't understand why anyone would want to stay in one place for 4 decades. What kind of changes? David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder, the kind real estate agents use for listing presentations. He set it on the counter between us, like evidence in a trial. Just some information about communities designed for people in your situation, places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work, or whether the furnace is going to break down in the middle of winter. I didn't open the folder, didn't need to. I could imagine the glossy photographs of generic apartments with beige carpets and small windows, the marketing copy about active adult communities, and worry-free living. Places where you could exist comfortably without actually living. And this house would sell quickly. The market's strong right now, especially for properties like this one. You could use the proceeds to buy something smaller, maybe put the rest aside for future needs. Future needs. Another euphemism, this one for the long slide toward dependency that he seemed to think was inevitable. I closed the folder without looking inside. I appreciate your concern, David. I do. But I'm not ready to sell this house. Not ready or not willing to admit you should. The question hung between us like a challenge. For the first time since he'd arrived, I really looked at my son, not the successful businessman in the expensive suit, but the boy I'd taught to throw a curveball in the backyard, who'd cried when his goldfish died, who'd called me from college every Sunday night his freshman year because he was homesick. That boy was gone, had been gone for years maybe. In his place stood a man who spoke about my life as if it were a problem to be solved, who'd reduced 43 years of marriage to a real estate transaction, who seemed to believe that love meant making decisions for people whether they wanted you to or not. I'm willing to admit that this conversation is over, I said quietly. David's jaw tightened. Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this. I'm thinking very clearly. You want me to sell the house your mother loved, give up the workshop where I've spent 30 years building furniture, move into some sterile apartment where I can't plant a garden or fix what's broken or wake up in the same bedroom where your mother and I stopped myself, seeing something shift in his expression. Where you and Mom... What? The question was asked too quickly, with too much interest, as if he were fishing for something specific. Nothing, I said. Where we lived our lives. But David was watching me now, with the focused attention of a detective who'd just heard something significant. Dad, is there something about Mom, about her death, that you haven't told me? The words seemed to echo in the quiet kitchen. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the street, the sound distant and ordinary. But inside this room, something had shifted, The conversation we'd been having about the house had become something else entirely. What kind of question is that? The kind that needs an answer. David's voice had gone flat, professional. Because I've been going through some of Mom's papers, trying to help you organize things. And there are some inconsistencies, some things that don't quite add up. My coffee had gone cold in my hands. I set the mug down carefully, buying time while my mind raced. Margaret's papers. I'd asked David to help me sort through her files months ago, when the task felt too overwhelming to face alone. Medical records, insurance documents, financial statements, the paper trail of a life lived responsibly, carefully, with attention to detail. What inconsistencies? David reached into the folder again, this time pulling out a manila envelope. Her life insurance policy, for one. The beneficiary was changed just 2 weeks before she died, from me to you. The accusation sat between us like a loaded gun. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, could see the way David was watching for my reaction. Your mother made that change herself. She wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of. According to the paperwork, yes, but the signature... David opened the envelope, revealing photocopies of insurance documents. It doesn't look quite right. Too steady for someone in her condition. Too practiced. The word hung in the air like poison gas. Practiced. As if I'd been rehearsing Margaret's signature, planning for her death, calculating my benefit from her dying. What are you saying, David? I'm saying I think we need to take a closer look at the circumstances of Mom's death, at who benefited from it, at whether everything happened exactly the way you've told people it did. The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. This wasn't about the house anymore, wasn't about my ability to live independently. This was something else entirely, something darker and more devastating than I could have imagined. My son thought I'd killed his mother. I looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, holding papers that he believed proved my guilt, and felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been broken the day Margaret died. Something deeper. Something that had to do with trust and family and the assumption that your children knew you well enough to know what you were capable of. Get out, I said quietly. Dad, get out of my house. David gathered his papers, his expression shifting from determination to something that might have been regret. I don't want to believe it either, he said. But if you did something, if you helped her along because you thought it was merciful, people would understand. The insurance money, keeping the house, we could work all that out. Get out. He left through the front door, and I listened to his car pull away before I allowed myself to sink into Margaret's chair at the breakfast table. The folder he'd brought lay open on the counter, its contents spilled across the granite surface she'd chosen because it would last forever. I sat there for a long time, looking at the insurance papers with their accusations hidden in photocopied signatures, thinking about the son I'd raised and the man he'd become, thinking about Margaret's final weeks, when pain medication had made her handwriting shaky, but her mind remained sharp as ever, thinking about the morning she'd called the insurance company herself, speaking clearly and precisely about wanting to change her beneficiary because Richard has taken such good care of me. I thought about all of this, and then I got up and walked to the oak filing cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, the one Margaret had organized with her characteristic thoroughness, every document labeled and dated and filed in exactly the right place. If David wanted to play detective, I'd give him something to investigate. But first, I needed to understand exactly what kind of game he thought he was playing and why he'd chosen to play it with me. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window had shifted, marking the passage of time in the way it always had in this house. Margaret used to set her coffee cup in exactly the spot where the light would hit it at 9:15, turning the plain white ceramic into something that glowed like stained glass. Now the light fell on David's abandoned folder, illuminating papers that accused me of the one thing I could never have done. I picked up the phone to call my lawyer. Some games, once started, have to be played to the end. Quick pick, heartbroken or broken. The phone rang 3 times before Marcus Henley picked up. His voice carried the gravelly weight of 40 years practicing law in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and most of it ended up in his office eventually. Richard, everything all right? I'd known Marcus since before David was born, back when Margaret and I bought our first house and needed someone to review the mortgage paperwork. He'd handled our wills, the business incorporation when I'd started the furniture shop, and Margaret's estate after she died. If anyone understood the legal architecture of our life together, it was Marcus. "I need to see you," I said. "Today, if possible." "What's this about?" I looked at the insurance papers scattered across my counter, at David's careful annotations in the margins, at the yellow sticky notes marking what he considered evidence of my guilt. "My son thinks I forged his mother's signature on some documents. He thinks I may have—" I paused, testing the words before I spoke them aloud. "He thinks I may have hastened her death." Silence stretched across the line. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had shifted into the careful neutral tone he used when the stakes were high. "Don't say another word over the phone. Can you be at my office in an hour?" "I'll be there." Marcus's office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, above the pharmacy that had been there since the 1940s. The waiting room smelled of old leather and industrial carpet, and the receptionist who'd been there almost as long as Marcus himself looked up with practiced sympathy when I walked in. "He's expecting you, Mr. Dalton. Go right on back." Marcus stood when I entered, extending a hand that gripped mine with the firmness of a man who'd spent decades delivering news both good and terrible. He was my age, maybe a year older, with white hair that had been white for as long as I'd known him, and the kind of face that inspired confidence in people who needed it most. "Sit down, Richard. Tell me what's happened." I spread David's papers across his desk, the same way David had spread them across my kitchen counter. Marcus put on his reading glasses and studied each document with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned not to miss details. "These are photocopies," he said after several minutes. "David made them from the originals." "Where are the originals?" "In Margaret's filing system, where they've always been." Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Richard, I was there when Margaret signed these papers. She called me the day before, asked me to come to the house because she wanted to make some changes to her beneficiary designations. Said she'd been thinking about it for weeks." The weight in my chest lifted slightly. "You witnessed the signature?" "I witnessed her sign 3 different documents: the insurance policy, the retirement account beneficiary form, and a codicil to her will. She was weak, yes, but her mind was completely clear. She made jokes about outliving us all out of pure stubbornness." I remembered that afternoon. Margaret had been having one of her better days, alert enough to tease Marcus about his new bifocals, strong enough to sit at her desk for almost an hour while they worked through the paperwork. I'd brought them tea and listened to her explain her reasoning with the same logical precision she'd applied to everything else in our marriage. "She wanted to protect you," Marcus continued. "Said David was doing well for himself, had his own career and his own life, but that you'd sacrificed your earning potential to take care of her during her illness. She was worried about your financial security. David thinks the signature looks too steady, too practiced." Marcus pulled out a manila folder from his desk drawer. "I keep copies of everything we do here, including the documents Margaret signed that day." He opened the folder, revealing crisp copies of the same papers David had shown me. "Look at the signatures." I studied them side by side, David's photocopies and Marcus's originals. The handwriting was identical, down to the distinctive way Margaret had always dotted her I's and crossed her T's. But more than that, I could see the slight tremor in some of the letters, the places where her hand had shaken from medication or fatigue. It wasn't the handwriting of a healthy person, but it was unmistakably hers. Why would David think these were forged? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers with an expression I couldn't read. "Richard, has David been having financial difficulties lately?" The question caught me off guard. "Not that I know of. His practice seems to be doing well. He and Lisa bought that new house last year, took a vacation to Europe. Sometimes people who appear successful are the ones struggling most. Success can be expensive to maintain." I thought about David's Audi in my driveway, about the designer suit he'd worn to accuse me of murder, about the way he'd talked about the house as if it were an asset to be liquidated rather than a home to be preserved. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that someone facing financial pressure might look at their inheritance differently than they would otherwise, might become impatient about timing, might start to wonder if the person controlling those assets is making the right decisions." The words settled into my stomach like cold stones. "You think David needs money. I think David wants you to sell the house. And I think he's willing to question your mental capacity, your moral character, even your potential criminality to get what he wants. I stared at the papers spread across Marcus's desk, seeing them with new eyes. Not evidence of my guilt, but evidence of David's desperation. The careful annotations, the yellow sticky notes, the way he'd presented them as if the case were already proven. It all suggested someone who'd been building his argument for a while. What should I do? Marcus began gathering the papers into neat stacks. First, we document everything. Every conversation you've had with David about the house, about your health, about Margaret's death. Every suggestion he's made about your mental state or your decision-making capacity. Second, we secure the original documents. I want everything related to Margaret's estate in my safe, not in your house where David has access. You think he'd take them? I think a man desperate enough to accuse his father of murder is capable of anything. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every familiar landmark seeming somehow foreign, as if I were seeing my own neighborhood through different eyes. The house David wanted me to sell, the life he wanted me to abandon, the memories he was willing to destroy to get what he wanted. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment in the car, looking at the home Margaret and I had built together. The front porch where we'd watched David learn to ride his bike, where we'd sat with our morning coffee on countless summer weekends. The garden where Margaret had spent hours nurturing roses that bloomed in defiance of Missouri clay and unpredictable weather. The workshop behind the garage where I'd built most of our furniture by hand, each piece designed to last generations. David saw all of this as assets to be converted to cash. I saw it as the physical manifestation of a life lived with purpose and love. My phone buzzed with a text message. David's name appeared on the screen. Dad, I know this is hard to hear, but we need to talk about getting you some help. I've been in touch with some people who specialize in these situations. Please call me. I deleted the message without responding. Inside, the house felt different somehow, as if David's accusations had left residue in the air. I walked through the rooms Margaret had decorated with such care, touching surfaces she'd chosen, straightening pictures she'd hung, remembering conversations we'd had about every purchase, every decision, every small choice that had accumulated into a home. In our bedroom, her clothes still hung in the closet. Her books remained stacked on the nightstand. Her reading glasses lay folded on the dresser where she'd left them the last time she'd been strong enough to read. David would call this unhealthy, evidence of my inability to move forward, proof that I wasn't thinking clearly about the future. But I called it love. And love, I was beginning to understand, was something David had forgotten how to recognize. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through Margaret's files with new eyes, not looking for evidence of forgery, but for evidence of David's recent interest in our financial affairs. I found it in small things, papers slightly out of order, files not quite returned to their proper places, the subtle signs that someone had been searching through documents that didn't belong to them. In the folder containing our tax returns, I found a sticky note in David's handwriting. Check depreciation on rental property. In the insurance files, another note. Verify beneficiary change dates. In Margaret's medical records, a third note. Timeline inconsistencies. He'd been building his case for months, maybe longer, visiting under the pretense of helping me organize, expressing concern about my ability to manage alone, all while cataloging what he saw as evidence of my guilt. The phone rang at 6:30. David again. Dad, please don't ignore me. I know this is difficult, but if we don't address this properly, it could become a legal matter. I don't want that for either of us. A legal matter. The threat was clear enough. Cooperate with his plans for my life, or face public accusations of insurance fraud and murder. I hung up without responding and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden Margaret had loved. The roses were in full bloom now, their colors vivid against the green backdrop of summer foliage. She'd planted them the year after David graduated college, when the house had felt too quiet, and she'd needed something beautiful to nurture. What should I do, Maggie? I asked the empty air. The answer came not in words but in memory. Margaret at her desk during those final weeks, insisting on handling her own affairs despite the pain and weakness. I want to make sure you're taken care of, she'd said. David will be fine. He's young and strong and capable. But you've given up so much to care for me. This is my way of caring for you. She'd known somehow that David would question her decisions, had known that he might see her final acts of love as opportunities for accusation, and she'd documented everything carefully, thoroughly, with the help of a lawyer who could testify to her mental capacity and her genuine intentions. Margaret had protected me even from our own son. The realization brought tears I hadn't shed since her funeral. Not tears of grief, though grief was there, but tears of gratitude for a woman who had understood the full complexity of love, including its potential for betrayal. I wiped my eyes and walked to the phone. Marcus answered on the first ring. "Richard, how are you holding up?" "I found something," I said. "David's been going through Margaret's papers for months. He's been planning this accusation for a long time. Can you prove that?" I looked at the sticky notes in David's handwriting, at the evidence of his systematic search through our private documents. "Yes, I think I can." "Good, because I've been making some calls of my own about David's financial situation. And Richard, I think you need to know what I found." The weight in my chest shifted, settling into a new configuration. The game David thought he was playing was more complicated than either of us had realized. "Tell me," I said. And in the quiet of the kitchen where Margaret and I had shared 43 years of conversations, I listened to Marcus explain exactly why my son was so eager to see me dead or declared incompetent. The truth, as it turned out, was simpler and more devastating than I'd imagined. Marcus's voice carried the weight of bad news delivered by a man who'd spent decades learning how to cushion blows that couldn't be softened. "David's in trouble, Richard. Real trouble. The kind that makes desperate men do desperate things." I sank into Margaret's chair at the breakfast table, the same spot where she used to sit with her morning crossword, working through clues with the patient determination she'd applied to every problem in our 43 years together. "What kind of trouble?" "His law practice is failing. Has been for over a year. 3 major clients pulled their accounts after some kind of billing dispute, and word got around. You know how it is in a town this size? Reputation is everything." I did know. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, a lawyer's credibility was his most valuable asset. Once that was damaged, rebuilding took years, if it could be rebuilt at all. But the new house, the European vacation, financed, all of it. The house has a mortgage that's bigger than what it's worth in this market. The credit cards are maxed out. And Richard, there's more. David took out a loan against his practice 6 months ago. Used the equipment and client list as collateral. If he can't make the payments, he loses everything. The kitchen seemed to spin around me. "How much does he owe?" Including the house, the business loan, and the credit cards, just over $400,000. The number hit like a physical blow. Margaret's life insurance policy had been worth $350,000. The house, in today's market, would probably sell for another $300,000. Together, it would be enough to solve David's problems with money left over to start fresh somewhere else. "He needs me dead," I said quietly, "or declared incompetent. Either way, he becomes the administrator of your assets, and with his power of attorney, he could make decisions about selling the house, liquidating investments, managing your care." I thought about David's folder, his careful documentation of my supposed mental decline, his suggestions about assisted living facilities and medical needs. It hadn't been concern for my welfare. It had been preparation for a legal strategy. "Marcus, if he pursues this, if he actually tries to have me declared incompetent, we'll fight it, and we'll win. But Richard, the process itself could be devastating. Court hearings, medical evaluations, testimony from neighbors and friends about your mental state. Even if you're completely vindicated, the damage to your reputation, your privacy, your peace of mind." I understood. David had chosen a weapon that would wound me regardless of whether it succeeded. The mere accusation would poison every relationship I had, every interaction with people who'd known and respected me for decades. Neighbors would whisper about the crazy old man who'd been investigated for killing his wife. Friends would wonder if there had been truth to the allegations. The life Margaret and I had built together would be reduced to gossip and speculation. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "I did some checking on Lisa's family situation. Her parents are facing some financial difficulties of their own. Medical bills from her father's cancer treatment last year. They've been staying with David and Lisa for the past 2 months. The picture was becoming clearer. A desperate son facing financial ruin. in-laws who needed support he couldn't provide, a wife who'd grown up expecting a certain standard of living, and at the center of it all, an elderly father sitting on assets worth more than $500,000, living alone in a house too big for one person. From David's perspective, it probably seemed logical, practical even. I was old, alone, clinging to memories and possessions that served no productive purpose. Why shouldn't those resources be put to better use? Why shouldn't they solve real problems for people who were young enough to benefit from them? But logic and love were different things. And what David saw as practical resource allocation, I saw as the systematic destruction of everything Margaret and I had built together. What are my options, Marcus? Legally, we document everything, prepare for a competency challenge if it comes, and make sure your affairs are in order. Practically, you might consider making some changes yourself. Transfer assets into a trust. Update your will. Maybe even sell the house on your own terms, rather than waiting for David to force the issue. I looked around the kitchen, taking in the details that made it ours rather than just a room. The coffee mug Margaret had preferred, still sitting in its usual spot in the dish rack. The cookbook she'd annotated with her own modifications and improvements. The small herb garden visible through the window, where she'd grown basil and rosemary, and the mint she'd used in her iced tea every summer. I can't sell this house, Marcus, not yet. Then, we prepare for war. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, watching the afternoon light shift across surfaces Margaret had chosen and arranged with such care. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory, thick with the presence of someone who wasn't physically here but had never really left. I thought about the David I'd raised, the boy who'd learned to throw a baseball in the backyard, who'd helped me build birdhouses in the workshop, who'd called every Sunday during his first year of college because he missed home. That boy had grown into a man I barely recognized, someone capable of looking at his father's grief and seeing opportunity instead of pain. But maybe that transformation hadn't happened overnight. Maybe there had been signs I'd chosen not to see, warning signals I'd dismissed, because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that the child I'd loved unconditionally had grown into someone I might not be able to trust. The phone rang at 7:15. David's number appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message he left. Dad, I know you're angry with me, but please understand that I'm trying to help you. I've talked to Dr. Richardson about your situation, and he agrees that living alone at your age, especially with your history of heart problems, isn't safe. We need to sit down together, maybe with Lisa and a counselor, and work out a plan that's best for everyone. I'll come by tomorrow morning so we can talk about this like adults. The message was carefully worded, designed to sound reasonable and concerned, but underneath the surface concern was a threat. Cooperate with my plans, or I'll escalate this to involve medical professionals and family counselors and anyone else who might support my position, that you're no longer capable of managing your own life. I deleted the message and walked to Margaret's desk in the corner of the living room. She'd used it to pay bills, write letters, keep track of household expenses with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized everything she'd done. The drawers were still organized exactly as she'd left them, every document filed in its proper place, every paperclip and rubber band sorted into the small compartments she'd added to keep things neat. In the bottom drawer, behind the folders containing tax returns and insurance policies, I found what I was looking for, a manila envelope with my name written on it in Margaret's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated 3 weeks before she died. "My dearest Richard," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the question of what to do with the life we built together. I know David will pressure you to sell the house, to move somewhere smaller and more practical. He means well, but he doesn't understand that a home isn't just a place to live. It's the physical embodiment of a marriage, the container that held our love and our life together." I had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound of her voice in the carefully chosen words, the way she'd anticipated exactly the situation I was facing and prepared for it with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I also know," the letter continued, "that David may question some of the decisions I made about our finances and my estate. He's always been impatient with what he sees as sentimentality, and he may not understand why I chose to leave everything to you rather than dividing it between you both. Please know that this decision was made with complete clarity of mind and with his best interests at heart, even if he can't see it that way. The letter went on for 3 pages, explaining her reasoning, her hopes for my future, her concerns about David's tendency to see financial security as more important than emotional well-being. She'd understood him better than I'd realized, had seen the seeds of the accusations he would eventually make, and prepared responses I could use to defend myself. But the most important part came at the end. Richard, I need you to know that whatever David says or does, whatever pressure he brings to bear, you have every right to grieve in your own way and in your own time. This house, our things, the life we built together, they belong to you now, and you should do with them whatever brings you peace. Don't let anyone, not even our son, convince you that love is something to be overcome rather than cherished. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. Margaret had known. Somehow she'd seen this confrontation coming and armed me with the words I'd need to survive it. But words wouldn't be enough. If David was determined to pursue this course, if he was desperate enough to destroy our relationship and my reputation to solve his financial problems, then I needed more than Margaret's letter to protect myself. I needed to understand exactly how far he was willing to go, and I needed to be prepared to stop him. The next morning, I was ready when David's Audi pulled into my driveway at 8:30. I'd spent the night preparing, gathering documents, making phone calls, setting up defenses he wouldn't expect and couldn't easily overcome. When he knocked on the door, I opened it with a smile. "Good morning, son. Come in. I think it's time we had that conversation you wanted." David stepped inside, his expression cautiously optimistic, as if he thought my night of reflection had led me to see reason. He had no way of knowing that my night of reflection had led me to see him clearly for the first time in years. And what I saw was a stranger who happened to share my DNA, someone willing to destroy his father to save himself. The conversation we were about to have would determine which one of us walked away from this confrontation intact. I intended for it to be me. David followed me into the living room, his movements careful and measured, like a salesman who sensed the deal was close but didn't want to spook the customer. He'd dressed down today, khakis instead of the expensive suit, a polo shirt that said approachable family man rather than aggressive attorney. Even his cologne was more subtle, as if he'd calculated every detail to project trustworthiness and concern. "I'm glad you're willing to talk, Dad. I know yesterday was hard for both of us." I gestured to the couch where Margaret and I used to watch the evening news together, where she'd curl up with her knitting while I read the paper aloud. David sat on the edge of the cushions, leaning forward with his hands clasped, the posture of a man preparing to deliver important news with appropriate gravity. "Coffee?" I offered. "No, thanks. I think we should focus on the conversation." I poured myself a cup from the pot I'd made earlier, taking my time, letting him wait. The delay seemed to make him nervous. His right leg began bouncing slightly, and he glanced around the room as if cataloging items for an estate sale. "David," I said finally, settling into my reading chair, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the insurance papers, about your concerns regarding your mother's death." His expression brightened. "I'm so glad. I know how difficult this must be, but I called Marcus Henley." The words hit him like cold water. His legs stopped bouncing, and his face went very still. "You called Marcus?" "I wanted to understand the legal implications of what you're suggesting. After all, if you truly believe I forged your mother's signature, or hastened her death in some way, these are serious criminal allegations. I thought I should have legal representation." David's mouth opened and closed without sound. This clearly wasn't how he'd expected the conversation to go. "Dad, I never said anything about criminal charges. I just think there are some inconsistencies that need to be addressed. Maybe with a family counselor or..." "A family counselor?" I set my coffee cup down carefully, the china making a soft clink against the saucer. "Son, you accused me of forging documents and murder. That's not a family therapy issue. That's a matter for law enforcement." "I didn't say murder. I said maybe you helped her..." "The legal term for helping someone die is murder, David, even when it's done out of mercy." His face had gone pale, and I could see him recalculating, trying to find a way back to safer ground. "Look, maybe I came on too strong yesterday. Maybe I should have approached this differently. How should you have approached it? Maybe by talking about your financial security first, about making sure you're protected as you get older." I leaned back in my chair, studying him with the attention I'd once given to complex woodworking projects, looking for flaws in the grain, weaknesses that might cause the whole structure to fail under pressure. Marcus told me something interesting yesterday, David, about your financial situation. The color drained from his face completely now. My financial situation isn't relevant to, isn't it? A son facing bankruptcy suddenly becomes very concerned about his father's mental competency and starts questioning the validity of his mother's final wishes? Marcus says that's a classic pattern. Financial desperation leading to elder abuse. Elder abuse? David shot to his feet, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Dad, I'm trying to help you. Are you? Or are you trying to help yourself? That's not... I wouldn't... He stopped, seeming to realize that his protests sounded exactly like what they were, the desperate denials of someone caught in a lie. I stood as well, moving to the mantelpiece where Margaret's photograph smiled down at both of us. $400,000, David. That's what Marcus says you owe. How did he... David caught himself, but too late. How did he find out? Public records mostly, mortgage filings, business loans, court documents. It's all there if you know where to look. David sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. For a moment, he looked like the boy I'd raised, overwhelmed, defeated, needing his father to fix what he'd broken, but only for a moment. Okay, he said, lifting his head. Okay, yes, I'm in some financial trouble, but that doesn't change the fact that you're living alone in a house that's too big for you, that you're showing signs of confusion and memory problems. What signs? I interrupted. Mrs. Peterson said, Mrs. Peterson is 87 years old and hasn't had a meaningful conversation with me in 2 years. What else? The lights left on all night. I have insomnia since your mother died. Sometimes I read until dawn. The lawn mowing at 6 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to be productive. The noise ordinance doesn't start until 7, and I was finished by 6:30. David's jaw worked silently as he searched for other examples. You're living in the past, Dad. You keep everything exactly the way Mom left it. That's not healthy grieving, that's denial. Or it's love. But I suppose you wouldn't recognize the difference. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, and I saw them hit him like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the edge I remembered from his teenage years, when he'd been caught in some misbehavior and decided that attack was the best defense. Fine. You want to be cruel? Let's be cruel. You're a 72-year-old man living alone in a 4-bedroom house, talking to pictures of his dead wife, keeping her clothes in the closet like she might come back. You haven't dated, haven't traveled, haven't done anything but sit in this mausoleum for 3 years. If that's not mental decline, it's emotional suicide. And selling the house would cure me of loving your mother? Selling the house would give you a chance to actually live instead of just existing. Or it would solve your debt problems. The accusation hung between us like a blade. David's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Both things can be true, he said finally. I can need the money and still be concerned about your welfare. But which one came first? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden Margaret had tended with such care. The roses were full now, heavy with blooms that would last another month before the summer heat stressed them too much. She'd known exactly when to water them, when to prune them, when to leave them alone to find their own strength. David, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I will not sell this house. I will not move to an assisted living facility. I will not sign over power of attorney to you or anyone else. And if you continue to spread rumors about my mental state or make accusations about your mother's death, I will take legal action to protect myself. Dad, I'm not finished. I turned back to face him. Your mother left me everything because she trusted me to make good decisions about our life together. She knew you were struggling financially. Yes, she knew. And she chose not to enable your poor choices by dividing her estate. That's not true. She wouldn't have... I walked to Margaret's desk and retrieved the letter she'd left for me. She wrote this 3 weeks before she died. Would you like me to read the part where she explains why she didn't leave you half of everything? David stared at the envelope in my hands as if it contained a snake. She never said anything to me about money problems. Because she hoped you'd find a way to solve them yourself, like an adult. The cruelty in my voice surprised even me, but seeing David's reaction, the way he flinched as if I'd slapped him, I realized I'd been building up to this moment for years. All the times he'd been too busy to visit, too important to call, too successful to need the wisdom of an old man who'd built a life through patience and hard work rather than shortcuts and clever schemes. You want to know why your mother changed her beneficiaries? I continued. Because she saw this coming. She saw that you'd look at her death as a business opportunity rather than a loss to be grieved. She knew you'd pressure me to liquidate our life together to solve problems you'd created yourself. David's face was white now, his hands shaking slightly. She couldn't have known I'd have financial trouble. She knew you, David, better than I did, apparently. She knew that when times got tough, you'd look for someone else to blame, someone else to bail you out. That's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time you visited this house without wanting something? When's the last time you called just to check on me? Not because you had a favor to ask or a problem for me to solve. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. We both knew the truth. I thought so, I said quietly. David stood slowly, his movements those of a man who just learned that the ground beneath his feet was less solid than he'd believed. So what happens now? Now you go home to your wife and your debts and your problems, and you figure out how to solve them without stealing from your father. And if I don't, if I pursue the competency hearing anyway? I smiled, and it felt like the most honest expression I'd worn in months. Then you'll discover that I'm not as helpless as you thought, and you'll learn exactly how much evidence Marcus and I have been gathering about your financial situation, your access to your mother's papers, and your systematic campaign to undermine my reputation. David's eyes widened. You've been investigating me the same way you've been investigating me. The difference is, my accusations will be true. He stood there for a long moment, and I could see him running calculations, weighing the risks of continuing his campaign against the certainty of losing, if he did. Finally, he walked toward the door, moving like a man who had aged years in the span of an hour. At the threshold, he turned back. This isn't over, Dad. Yes, I said quietly. It is. After he left, I sat in Margaret's chair and held her letter in my hands, feeling the weight of words written by someone who'd loved me enough to anticipate this moment and prepare me for it. Outside, David's Audi backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, carrying with it the last remnants of the relationship I'd thought we had. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock, the whisper of air through vents Margaret had insisted we clean twice a year for efficiency. These were the sounds of a life lived with attention to detail, with respect for the things that lasted, with love for the person who'd shared it all. David was wrong about one thing. I wasn't living in the past. I was living with the past, letting it inform my present choices and guide my future decisions. The past, I'd learned, wasn't something to be overcome. It was something to be honored, and I intended to honor it, no matter who thought I shouldn't. The afternoon light was already shifting, painting the walls with the golden glow that came through the kitchen window at 3 o'clock. In a few hours, I'd start dinner, probably something simple, maybe the beef stew Margaret had taught me to make during our first winter together. I'd eat it at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, and I'd feel grateful for the privilege of remembering her in the place where we'd been happiest. Tomorrow, I'd call Marcus and tell him the conversation had gone exactly as we'd expected. David would likely retreat for now, regroup, maybe try a different approach. But the initial assault had failed, and we both knew it. The war wasn't over, but this battle was mine. And for the first time since Margaret died, that felt like enough. 3 days passed in deceptive quiet. David didn't call, didn't visit, didn't send any more carefully worded text messages about my welfare, but I'd been married to Margaret long enough to know that the absence of storm clouds didn't mean the weather had cleared. Sometimes it just meant the real tempest was still gathering strength. On Thursday morning, I was in the workshop behind the garage, sanding down an oak table I'd started before Margaret got sick and never finished. The familiar rhythm of the work, the steady back and forth motion, the gradual smoothing of rough edges, had always helped me think clearly. My hands knew what to do, leaving my mind free to consider problems that couldn't be solved with sandpaper and patience. I was contemplating the grain pattern in the wood, deciding which direction to run the final sanding, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. Not David's Audi, this engine had a different note, higher and more aggressive. I set down the sandpaper and walked to the window. A red Mercedes convertible sat in my driveway, its paint job so perfect it seemed to glow in the morning sun. The woman who emerged from the driver's seat was equally polished, mid-40s, blonde hair that had never known a humidity it couldn't defeat, wearing a white pantsuit that probably cost more than most people spend on a month of groceries. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, though she'd never seemed entirely comfortable with that title. I watched her walk to my front door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting her way through a combination of charm and persistence. Her heels clicked against the concrete with martial precision, and even from 50 yards away, I could see the determined set of her shoulders. She knocked once, waited exactly 10 seconds, then knocked again. When I didn't answer immediately, she walked around to the workshop window and spotted me inside. "Richard, could we talk, please?" I considered pretending I hadn't heard her, but cowardice had never been my style. Besides, I was curious about what approach she'd take. David's frontal assault had failed. Maybe Lisa thought feminine wiles and family loyalty would succeed, where accusations and threats had not. I opened the workshop door and gestured for her to come in. She picked her way carefully across the concrete floor, her heels navigating around wood shavings and scattered tools with the deliberate care of someone crossing a minefield. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," she said, her voice carrying the warm honey tone she used at church social functions and charity fundraisers. "I thought it might be easier to talk without David here. Sometimes men can be so stubborn about admitting when they need help." She glanced around the workshop, taking in the half-finished table, the tools organized on pegboards, the small pile of lumber in the corner. Her expression suggested she was looking at the eccentric hobbies of someone whose mind was already beginning to slip. "What can I do for you, Lisa?" "Well, I wanted to apologize for how David handled things the other day. He's under so much stress with work and everything, and sometimes he doesn't express himself as clearly as he should." Everything. Such a careful word, designed to acknowledge problems without admitting their scope. "Stress can make people say things they don't mean," I agreed. "Exactly." She smiled, clearly relieved that I seemed willing to be reasonable. "The thing is, Richard, even though David may have been too direct, his concerns are valid. We really are worried about you living alone in such a big house. It's not about the money, though of course we want to make sure your assets are protected. It's about your safety and happiness." I picked up the sandpaper and resumed working on the table's surface, letting the repetitive motion keep my hands busy while I listened to her carefully constructed arguments. The wood grain beneath my fingers was honest in a way human speech rarely was. What you saw was what you got, no hidden agendas or ulterior motives. "What exactly are you worried about?" "Well, for instance, your father fell last month and broke his hip. He was alone in the house for 6 hours before anyone found him. If something like that happened to you..." I paused in my sanding. "Your father fell?" "Oh yes, it was terrible. He's in assisted living now, and honestly, it's been such a relief. No more worrying about whether he's eating properly, whether he's taking his medications, whether he's going to hurt himself trying to fix something he shouldn't be touching." The picture was becoming clearer. Lisa's parents were facing the same transition David wanted to force on me, and from her perspective, it had been a success story. Problem solved, crisis averted, everyone safer and happier. "How does your father feel about the move?" Lisa's smile flickered slightly. "He's adjusting. Change is always difficult at first, but he's making friends, participating in activities. The social aspect has been wonderful for him, which meant he hated it but had no choice in the matter. The thing is, Richard," Lisa continued, "I've been doing some research about estate planning for older adults, and there are some real advantages to making these transitions sooner rather than later. Tax benefits, asset protection, Medicaid planning. If you wait until there's a crisis, your options become much more limited." "Asset protection," I repeated. "From what?" "Well, medical expenses for one thing. Long-term care costs can drain an estate very quickly. But if you transfer ownership of major assets to family members beforehand, those resources are protected." I set down the sandpaper and turned to face her fully. "Lisa, are you suggesting I sign over the house to David?" "Not necessarily the house, though that might make sense too, but certainly the investment accounts, the life insurance proceeds, maybe even the business assets from your furniture shop. The idea would be to restructure everything so that if you ever need expensive medical care, the government programs would cover it instead of depleting the estate. Her voice had taken on the smooth efficiency of someone delivering a practiced presentation. I wondered how many times she'd rehearsed this conversation, how many different angles she'd considered for approaching the stubborn old man who was standing between her family and financial security. And who would manage these assets after I transferred them? David, of course. As your son and a licensed attorney, he'd be the natural choice. But, Richard, this isn't about taking anything away from you. You'd still have access to everything you need. It would just be structured differently for tax and protection purposes. I walked to the workbench and picked up a plane, running my thumb along its blade to test the edge. Sharp enough to peel wood shavings so thin they were nearly transparent. Sharp enough to cut through deception, too, if applied with sufficient pressure. Lisa, do you know what David owes on his business loan? The question caught her off guard. Her carefully maintained smile wavered, and I saw uncertainty flicker in her eyes. I don't think David's business finances are relevant to $60,000, I continued, plus the credit cards, plus the second mortgage on your house. Marcus showed me the public records. Marcus Henley has no business discussing our private. Marcus has every business protecting his client from financial fraud. Which is what this is, isn't it? A plan to transfer my assets to David so he can use them to pay his debts. Lisa's composure finally cracked. Color flooded her cheeks, and her voice lost its honeyed warmth. Richard, you're being paranoid. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're criminals. Are you? Of course not. We're family. Family, I said quietly, doesn't usually require asset protection strategies. Lisa stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her recalculating, trying to decide whether to continue the pretense or abandon it entirely. Finally, she chose a third option. Attack. You know what your problem is, Richard? You're so wrapped up in the past, so obsessed with preserving some shrine to Margaret, that you can't see what's best for the people who are still alive. David is drowning, and you're sitting on resources that could save him. But you'd rather cling to a house and a bunch of old furniture than help your own son. And you'd rather destroy your father-in-law's life than face the consequences of your husband's poor decisions. Poor decisions? Lisa's voice rose to a near shout. David worked 60-hour weeks for 15 years building that practice. He's successful, respected, a pillar of the community. If he's having some temporary financial difficulties, it's because he invested in growth, took risks, tried to build something better for his family. And when the risks didn't pay off, he decided his father should cover the losses. He decided his father should act like a father instead of a selfish old man living in the past. The words echoed in the workshop, bouncing off concrete walls and power tools that had witnessed decades of honest work. I set the plane down carefully, making sure it was perfectly aligned with the edge of the workbench, giving myself time to absorb the full weight of what she'd said. Selfish. For wanting to keep the house Margaret and I had built together. For refusing to bankroll David's failed investments. For choosing to grieve in my own way rather than the way that would be most convenient for other people. Lisa, I said quietly, I think you should leave now. Richard, please, don't let pride destroy your relationship with David. He loves you. We both do. But love sometimes means making hard choices, accepting help even when you don't think you need it. The only hard choice here is whether to call the police or just let Marcus handle this through the courts. Her face went white. The police? Richard, you can't be serious. We haven't done anything illegal. Haven't you? Conspiracy to defraud an elderly person, elder abuse, attempted coercion of asset transfers. Marcus says those are serious charges, especially when the victim is over 70. Lisa backed toward the door, her earlier confidence completely gone. You're making a mistake, Richard, a big mistake. David was trying to protect you from having to go through legal proceedings. But if you insist on being difficult, are you threatening me, Lisa? I'm warning you, there are other ways to handle this situation, ways that won't be as pleasant for any of us. She left then, her heels clicking rapidly across the concrete as she fled to her Mercedes. I watched her reverse out of the driveway with unnecessary speed, leaving rubber marks on the asphalt that would remind me of this conversation every time I walked to the mailbox. I stood in the workshop for a long time after she left, looking at the half-finished table and thinking about the conversation that had just ended. Lisa had revealed more than she'd intended, not just about David's financial situation, but about their strategy going forward. If reasonable persuasion wouldn't work, they were prepared to try unreasonable coercion. The war I'd thought was ending was actually just beginning. I walked back to the house and called Marcus. "Richard, how did it go with David?" "David's sending reinforcements. Lisa just left. Marcus, I think they're planning to escalate this." "How so?" I told him about Lisa's visit, her threats about legal proceedings, her obvious preparation for asset transfer discussions. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds that suggested he'd heard similar stories before. "Richard," he said when I finished, "I think it's time we stopped playing defense and started playing offense." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we document everything that's happened so far, file a protective order to prevent harassment, and put them on notice that any further attempts to coerce or intimidate you will result in criminal charges." "Can we do that?" "We can. And Richard, I think we should also consider making some changes to your estate planning. If they're going to claim you're incompetent, let's make sure your competency is clearly established through current legal documents." I looked around the kitchen, taking in the quiet domestic details that made this place home rather than just a house. Margaret's coffee cup in the dish rack, her reading glasses on the counter beside yesterday's newspaper, the small ceramic bowl where she'd kept spare change and grocery store coupons. These people wanted to take all of this away from me, to reduce 43 years of marriage to a line item on a balance sheet. They wanted to warehouse me in some sterile facility where I could exist safely and quietly until I died, leaving them free to liquidate the life Margaret and I had built together. "Let's do it," I said. "All of it. But Marcus?" "Yes?" "I want to do more than just defend myself. I want to make sure they never try this with anyone else." "What did you have in mind?" I smiled, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not grief this time, but determination. The kind of focused resolve that had helped me build a successful business from nothing, that had carried Margaret and me through 43 years of marriage, that had sustained me through the worst period of my life. "I want to make them understand exactly who they're dealing with," I said, "and I want them to regret the day they decided I was too old and weak to fight back." The afternoon light was already beginning to slant through the workshop windows, painting everything in gold. Soon it would be time to start dinner, to settle into the evening routine that had sustained me through 3 years of widowhood. But first, I had some planning to do. David and Lisa thought they were fighting a confused old man who would eventually capitulate to their pressure. They had no idea they'd declared war on someone who'd spent 7 decades learning that the most dangerous opponent was the one who had nothing left to lose except his dignity. And I intended to keep mine, no matter what it cost them. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, while I was standing at the kitchen window watching the sunrise paint Margaret's garden in shades of gold and amber. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet like an alarm, and I knew before I answered that this wasn't going to be good news. "Richard, it's Marcus. I need to see you immediately. Something's happened." "What kind of something?" "The kind we discuss in person. Can you be at my office in an hour?" I dressed quickly, skipping my usual breakfast routine, and drove downtown through streets that were just beginning to show signs of restored morning activity. The early commuters heading to jobs, the dog walkers making their first rounds, the delivery trucks restocking businesses for another day of commerce. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by family betrayals and legal warfare. Marcus's office building looked different in the early morning light. Older, more weathered, as if the dawn had stripped away some protective veil and revealed its true age. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, and found Marcus waiting for me with an expression I'd never seen before. He looked scared. "Sit down, Richard." I settled into the familiar chair across from his desk, noting the stack of documents arranged with unusual precision, the legal pad covered with notes in Marcus's careful handwriting, the coffee cup that had clearly been refilled multiple times. "How long have you been here?" "Since 4:30. I got a call yesterday evening from a colleague in the district attorney's office. Richard, David has filed a formal complaint against you." The words hit like cold water, but I'd been expecting something like this since Lisa's visit. "What kind of complaint?" Marcus opened the top folder and slid a document across the desk. elder fraud, insurance fraud, and... He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Suspicion of homicide in connection with Margaret's death. The paper trembled in my hands as I read the formal allegations. David had provided a detailed timeline of Margaret's final weeks, complete with medical records he'd somehow obtained, pharmacy records showing pain medication prescriptions, and his own sworn statement describing my suspicious behavior around the time of her death. He's claiming I gave her an overdose. He's claiming you had means, motive, and opportunity. The means being access to her prescription medications. The motive being the insurance money and sole inheritance of the estate. The opportunity being that you were her primary caregiver during her final weeks. I set the document down, my hands surprisingly steady despite the chaos in my chest. Marcus, you were there. You saw Margaret sign those papers. You know she was competent, that she made those decisions herself. I know that. But Richard, David has been building this case for months. He has medical records showing Margaret's pain levels, pharmacy records documenting the strength and quantity of medication she was prescribed, even hospital records from her final admission. Hospital records? He's highlighting the fact that when she was admitted for what turned out to be her final stay, she was suffering from what the emergency room physician described as acute respiratory depression, possibly related to medication interaction. The attending physician noted that her symptoms were consistent with opioid overdose, though they were able to stabilize her temporarily. I remembered that night with brutal clarity. Margaret had been having one of her bad days, the pain so intense that nothing seemed to help. She'd asked me to increase her medication. Just this once, just enough to let her sleep. I'd followed the doctor's instructions exactly. But she'd been so small by then, so fragile, that even the prescribed dose sometimes seemed like too much. They stabilized her, I said. She lived another week. A week during which, according to David's timeline, you had exclusive access to her medications and no medical supervision, except for the occasional hospice nurse visits. The picture David was painting became clear. A devoted husband overwhelmed by his wife's suffering, gradually increasing her pain medication until the line between mercy and murder became blurred. A man who stood to inherit everything if his wife died, nothing if she lived long enough to change her mind about her estate planning. There's more, Marcus continued. David has statements from neighbors describing your behavior as erratic in the months following Margaret's death. Mrs. Peterson apparently told him you were seen working in the garden at all hours, talking to yourself, sometimes appearing confused about what day it was. I was grieving. I know that. Any reasonable person would know that. But David is painting a picture of a man whose guilt over his wife's death manifested in mental instability and social isolation. I stood and walked to Marcus's window, looking down at the street where morning traffic was beginning to build. Regular people heading to regular jobs, their biggest concerns probably involving deadlines and meetings, and whether to stop for coffee on the way to work. What happens now? The DA's office has to investigate. They'll interview you, me, Margaret's doctors, anyone who had contact with her during her final weeks. They'll review all the medical records, the pharmacy records, the insurance paperwork. And Richard. Marcus's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. If they find probable cause, they'll arrest you. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Arrest, handcuffs, perp walk. The local newspaper running headlines about the elderly man who'd killed his wife for money. The destruction of everything Margaret and I had built together, not through David's financial schemes, but through public disgrace and criminal prosecution. How long do I have? The investigation will take weeks, maybe months. But Richard, there's something else. Something David doesn't know we know. I turned back from the window. What? Marcus pulled out another file, this one thicker than the first. I spent most of the night going through Margaret's medical records, not just the ones from her final hospitalization, but everything from the past 2 years, her cancer diagnosis, her treatment records, her pain management protocols. And I found something interesting. 3 weeks before she died, Margaret had a consultation with a different doctor. Not her oncologist, not her primary care physician, a specialist in palliative medicine. I felt my breath catch. Margaret had never mentioned seeing another doctor. Dr. Sarah Chen, over in Springfield. She specializes in end-of-life care, pain management for terminal patients. According to her notes, Margaret asked specifically about medication management for someone in her condition. Marcus opened the file, revealing pages of medical notes in careful handwriting. The consultation was extensive. Margaret described her pain levels, her current medication regimen, her concerns about the side effects of increasing doses. Dr. Chen provided detailed guidance about safe dosing, about how to manage breakthrough pain, about the risks and benefits of different approaches. Why didn't Margaret tell me about this? Because she was protecting you. Marcus looked up from the file. According to Dr. Chen's notes, Margaret was concerned about putting you in a position where you'd have to make difficult decisions about her care. She wanted to understand her options herself, to make informed choices about her own treatment. I sank back into my chair, overwhelmed by the image of Margaret, already weakened by cancer, already struggling with pain, driving herself to Springfield to consult with a doctor she'd never met because she wanted to spare me the burden of difficult decisions. There's more, Marcus continued. Dr. Chen's notes indicate that Margaret specifically asked about self-administered pain relief, about having control over her own medication schedule. Dr. Chen provided written guidelines for safe self-dosing, including warnings about maximum safe levels and drug interactions. The implications hit me like lightning. Margaret was managing her own medications. More than that, according to Dr. Chen's records, Margaret was given specific instructions about how to adjust her dosing based on her pain levels, with clear warnings about the maximum safe amounts. And Richard, those guidelines show that on the night she was hospitalized, Margaret's blood levels were within the range Dr. Chen had defined as safe. Then how? Terminal cancer patients can develop sudden tolerance changes. Their bodies process medications differently as the disease progresses. What was a safe dose one day can become dangerous the next, not because of overdose, but because of changes in metabolism and organ function. I stared at the medical records spread across Marcus's desk, seeing my wife's final weeks with new clarity. Not a helpless patient whose husband was gradually poisoning her, but a strong woman taking control of her own end-of-life care, making informed decisions about her own body based on expert medical guidance. Does David know about Dr. Chen? No, and that's our advantage. David's case is built on the assumption that you were Margaret's sole medication manager, that any overdose would have to be the result of your actions. But if Margaret was following Dr. Chen's protocols for self-administered care, then David's entire theory falls apart. More than that, it proves Margaret was competent and in control of her own medical decisions right up until the end, which supports the validity of the insurance beneficiary changes and undermines any claim that she was coerced or manipulated. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since this nightmare began. Not relief, we weren't there yet, but hope. Margaret had protected me even from accusations I couldn't have anticipated, had built a defense against charges I hadn't known were coming. What do we do now? We give the district attorney everything: Dr. Chen's consultation records, the self-dosing protocols, the medical literature about tolerance changes in terminal cancer patients. We show them that Margaret's death, while tragic, was the natural result of end-stage cancer complications, not homicide. And David? Marcus's expression hardened. David has just made a serious mistake. Filing false criminal charges is a felony. And Richard, I think we now have enough evidence to prove he knew his allegations were baseless. How? Because he had access to Margaret's medical records, the same records that would have shown Dr. Chen's consultation if he'd bothered to look for it. His failure to investigate thoroughly before making accusations could be seen as malicious prosecution. I thought about David's visit, his careful documentation of my supposed guilt, his systematic campaign to undermine my credibility. Had he been building a criminal case all along, or had the financial pressure simply driven him to escalate beyond what he'd originally planned? Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Based on everything you know, everything you've seen, do you think David actually believes I killed Margaret? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the files spread across his desk. When he looked up, his expression was sad but certain. No, he said. I think David knows exactly what happened to Margaret. I think he knows you're innocent, but I also think he's desperate enough to destroy you anyway, if that's what it takes to solve his financial problems. The words hit harder than any accusation David could have made. It was one thing to be wrongly suspected by a son who genuinely believed his father capable of murder. It was something else entirely to be deliberately framed by someone who knew better, someone willing to sacrifice his father's life and reputation to save himself. Then this isn't really about Margaret's death at all. No, Marcus said quietly. This is about a man who's drowning and doesn't care who he pulls down with him. I stood, feeling older than my 72 years, but steadier than I had felt in days. Then, let's make sure he drowns alone. Marcus began gathering the files. I'll contact the district attorney this morning, provide them with Dr. Chen's records, explain the medical context they're missing. With any luck, they'll drop the investigation before it goes any further. And David is about to learn that actions have consequences, and that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. I left Marcus's office with my head held high, walking through morning sunlight that felt warmer than it had in weeks. The criminal allegations would be resolved in my favor. I was certain of that now. But the damage to my relationship with David was irreparable. He'd looked into his father's eyes and chosen to see a murderer, rather than a man who'd loved his wife enough to care for her through the worst illness imaginable. He'd decided that his financial problems mattered more than his father's life, his mother's memory, or the basic decency that should exist between family members. Some betrayals were so complete that forgiveness became impossible, not because of cruelty or spite, but because forgiveness required a foundation of shared humanity. And David had forfeited any claim to that. The war between us was ending, but not with reconciliation. It was ending with the recognition that we were no longer father and son in any meaningful sense. We were simply strangers who happened to share the same last name. And that, I thought as I drove home through streets filled with morning promise, was exactly the relationship David deserved. The district attorney's office called 3 days later while I was in Margaret's garden, deadheading the roses she'd planted the year David graduated from law school. The timing felt appropriate somehow, tending to something she'd nurtured while receiving news that would determine whether her memory would be forever tainted by her son's accusations. Mr. Dalton, this is Assistant District Attorney Karen Walsh. I'm calling regarding the complaint filed against you by your son. Could you come in this afternoon to discuss the matter? I brushed the dirt from my hands and checked the kitchen clock. 2:15. What time works for you? I'm 4 o'clock. And Mr. Dalton, you might want to bring your attorney. Marcus was waiting for me in the DA's office lobby when I arrived, his expression cautiously optimistic. We'd spent the morning reviewing Dr. Chen's records one more time, preparing for questions we hoped we wouldn't have to answer. Karen Walsh turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every excuse and seen every variety of human weakness the law had to offer. Her handshake was firm, professional, neither warm nor cold. Gentlemen, thank you for coming in. Mr. Dalton, I've spent the past 3 days reviewing the complaint filed by your son, along with the additional medical records your attorney provided. I have some questions, but first I want to be clear about where this investigation stands. She opened a thick file and pulled out several documents, arranging them on the conference table between us. Based on the medical evidence, including Dr. Sarah Chen's consultation records and the self-dosing protocols she provided to your wife, I see no evidence of criminal activity in connection with Margaret Dalton's death. Her blood chemistry at the time of her final hospitalization was consistent with prescribed medication levels for someone following Dr. Chen's pain management guidelines. The words hit me like a physical release of pressure I'd been carrying for days. Not vindication, I'd known I was innocent, but official acknowledgement that Margaret's death had been what I'd always known it was, the natural, if heartbreaking conclusion of her battle with cancer. However, Walsh continued, I have serious concerns about the complaint itself. Mr. Dalton, are you aware that filing false criminal charges is a felony? Marcus explained that to me, yes. Good. Because the complaint filed by your son contains several factual errors that suggest either deliberate misrepresentation or failure to conduct due diligence before making serious accusations. She pulled out another document, David's sworn statement, with several paragraphs highlighted in yellow. For example, your son claims that you were the sole person responsible for managing your wife's pain medication, but Dr. Chen's records clearly show that your wife was following a self-administered protocol. Your son also claims that your wife's final hospitalization was the result of medication overdose, when the medical records show it was actually caused by cancer progression and associated respiratory complications. David had access to Margaret's medical files, Marcus said. He could have found Dr. Chen's consultation records if he'd looked for them. That's what concerns me, Walsh replied. Either your son failed to investigate thoroughly before filing criminal charges, which would be negligent, or he found evidence that contradicted his theory and chose to ignore it, which would be malicious. I thought about David sitting in my living room, carefully laying out his case like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The photocopied insurance documents, the timeline of Margaret's final weeks, the accusations delivered with the confidence of someone who'd done his homework. But he hadn't done his homework. He'd built a case based on assumptions and wishful thinking, ignoring evidence that didn't support the conclusion he wanted to reach. What happens now? I asked. Now, I close this investigation with no charges filed. But Mr. Dalton, I want you to understand something. False accusations of this nature can destroy lives even when they're ultimately proven wrong. The mere suggestion that you might have hastened your wife's death could follow you for years, affecting your relationships, your reputation, your peace of mind. I nodded, thinking about the neighbors who might always wonder, the friends who might always harbor a small doubt, the way David's accusations would cast a shadow over every memory of Margaret's final weeks. More importantly, Walsh continued, this kind of malicious prosecution undermines the legitimate work we do. Investigating actual elder abuse cases. When people file false charges for personal gain, it makes it harder for real victims to get justice. She closed the file and looked directly at me. Mr. Dalton, you have grounds for a civil suit against your son. Malicious prosecution, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages could be substantial. What kind of damages? Financial compensation for the stress and harm caused by false accusations. In cases like this, juries sometimes award significant punitive damages to deter similar conduct. Marcus leaned forward. Karen, what kind of numbers are we talking about? Given the seriousness of the accusations, the clear evidence of malice, and the defendant's financial resources, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. The irony was inescapable. David had accused me of murder to try to access my assets, and in doing so, he'd created a situation where those assets might be awarded to me as damages for his false accusations. His desperate attempt to solve his financial problems had potentially made them worse. There's one more thing, Walsh said. Mr. Dalton, during our investigation, we discovered that your son has been in contact with several elderly clients of his law practice, discussing estate planning strategies that would involve transferring assets to family members. Given what we've seen in your case, I'm concerned about a pattern of predatory behavior. You think David has done this to other people? I think your son has learned to see elderly clients as sources of financial opportunity rather than people deserving protection. We're going to be reviewing his other cases, looking for similar patterns. I felt sick thinking about other families torn apart by David's schemes. Other elderly parents pressured to surrender their independence and assets to solve problems they hadn't created. I want to pursue the civil suit, I said. Not for the money, but to make sure David faces consequences for what he's done, and to send a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Walsh smiled for the first time since we'd met. I was hoping you'd say that. Marcus, let me know if you need any assistance with the prosecution file. We'll provide whatever documentation you need. The drive home was quiet, both Marcus and I lost in our own thoughts. The immediate crisis was over, the criminal investigation closed, my reputation cleared, Margaret's memory protected from David's accusations. But the larger questions remained. How had my relationship with my son deteriorated to the point where he was willing to accuse me of murder? And was there any path back from this level of betrayal? Marcus, I said as we pulled into my driveway, do you think David actually expected to succeed with this? Did he really think he could frame me for murder and get away with it? Marcus turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. I think David was drowning, and drowning people don't always think clearly about the consequences of their actions. They grab onto whatever they think might save them, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. And now Now David is about to discover that actions have consequences, and that some actions have consequences far worse than the problems they were meant to solve. That evening, I called Dr. Chen's office in Springfield and asked to speak with her directly. When she came on the line, her voice was warm but professional. "Mr. Dalton, I was wondering when I might hear from you. I was so sorry to learn about the investigation. Margaret spoke about you with such love during our consultation. She never told me she'd seen you. She was trying to protect you from having to make difficult decisions about her care. Margaret was one of the most thoughtful patients I've ever worked with. She wanted to understand every aspect of her treatment so she could maintain control over her own end-of-life experience. Did she know how much time she had left? She knew she was dying, yes, but she also knew she wanted to spend her remaining time at home, with you, managing her own care as much as possible. The protocols I gave her were designed to help her do exactly that. I closed my eyes, seeing Margaret during those final weeks with new understanding. Not a passive victim of illness, but an active participant in her own care, making informed decisions about her treatment based on expert medical guidance. Dr. Chen, I need to ask you something. Is there any medical evidence that would support a theory that Margaret died from anything other than cancer progression? Absolutely not. I reviewed all of her final medical records when the DA's office contacted me. Everything is completely consistent with natural disease progression. Your son's accusations are not just wrong, Mr. Dalton. They're medically impossible given the documented evidence. After we hung up, I sat in Margaret's chair at the breakfast table and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My son had accused me of murdering the woman I'd loved more than life itself. He'd been willing to destroy my reputation, my peace of mind, and Margaret's memory to solve financial problems he'd created through his own poor decisions. But Margaret had protected me even from accusations she couldn't have anticipated. Her careful consultation with Dr. Chen, her insistence on maintaining control over her own medical care, her documentation of every decision, all of it had created an unshakable defense against David's lies. She'd been taking care of me right up until the end, and even beyond. The next morning, I called Marcus and told him to file the civil suit against David. Not for revenge, though the desire for that was certainly there, but for justice, for the principle that children don't get to destroy their parents' lives for financial gain, for the other elderly people who might be spared similar betrayals if David faced serious consequences for his actions, and for Margaret, whose final act of love had been to ensure that the truth would eventually prevail, no matter what lies her son was willing to tell. The war was ending, but not with reconciliation. It was ending with justice, and sometimes, I was learning, justice was the closest thing to peace that a broken family could achieve. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window felt warmer than it had in months, and for the first time since David's first accusation, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The truth had set me free. Now, it was time to make sure it held David accountable. If you want to see part 2, comment next to let us know.